topic is kind of a summary and wrap up of what Yasmin just shared. So this is a topic very close to my heart because my PhD thesis is sort of on this topic, although it was framed slightly broader, more about shape-changing materials for human-computer interaction. But a lot of the materials I studied in the past are driven by natural stimuli, especially relative humidity. And as Yasmin mentioned, this concept of relative humidity is a little bit different. It's actually very different from absolute humidity. It's to do with the moisture contents in the environment, water contents in the environment, but also the temperature, the absolute temperature of the environment. So very hot and very, very hot environment with a large concentration of water in the air means a very high relative humidity. So you can imagine Amazon forest, for example, will be a place with very high relative humidity, but versus Inner Mongolia, my hometown, even it's raining, it's super cold, it's not gonna be considered high relative humidity. And why nature has a lot of materials that are responding in a way that's called hydromorphic? Because moisture changes is, if not the most, at least one of the most readily available energy stimuli. So rain is everywhere. Moisture fluctuation can happen without rains as well. So if you think about day and night shift, when the temperature changes, you have a large changes in the relative humidity. And in the field of physics, material science, soft robotics, people actively study these types of hygromorphic actuation in nature, and especially in plants. So animals kind of have their own metabolism. There are a lot more going on. But if you think about mechanisms, plants move and morph. So hygromorphic transformation is one of the major ones. And for people who don't know the meaning of hygro literally means water, moisture. So when we say hygromorph, it's a way to say water or moisture driven actuation. And so the chart on the right was from a review paper by a team at Harvard. So the professor, who is a mathematician and physics, basically heavily studied hygromorphic structure. And he tried to plot the hygromorphic, actually plants actuation, let's say, based on different speed and also different dimension. So the idea is a lot of the hygromorphic behavior, because basically water-driven behaviors are very slow, are very gentle, and it tends to be slightly larger. But there are also some actuation that happens in nature, especially plants, that are super fast. Like if you guys know flytrap. Actually, I went to a little bit further away, maybe half an hour drive around Pittsburgh. There was a natural place. There's a dead lake, so-called dead because there's no flies. It's super quiet, just because inside the lake, there were a lot of those fly traps. So basically they ate all the insects, especially fly. That's why it's super quiet. It's like a zen place. But anyway, so there is this kind of plants. They basically harvesting this mechanical instability to do quick motions, much faster motion. So today we're mostly focusing on slower motion. It's also the easiest to study and also easiest to integrate into a lab, because you basically what you need is a sheet of wooden veneer you will buy from Amazon, spray some water, you can already see this phenomenon. So what Yasmin showed is like that, but she made it definitely more rigorous, more fancier. She's instead of investigating raw wood, she's trying to make wood powders and mix them in some sort of a polymers that can melt with heat, so you can have more controllability in its orientation and geometry, especially when you try to print those filaments out. But ultimately, the principles are very simple. These are all just basically those macrocellulose, they're absorbing water and swell. So a little bit more about wood. So this would be a class, it would be a subject you would encounter if you are taking a basic, for example, biopolymer class or biomechanics. So, so wood fibers essentially are made of cellulose, but they are also hemicellulose. And then cellulose, if you try to zoom it in, it contains microfibrils, and microfibrils can turn into nanofibrils. But all these fibrils are really stiff. They function as the sort of the skeleton components inside this wood material. If you say wood is a matrix, so then the cellulose fibers are the ones that don't respond to water. And all the other stuff, you know, like the hemicellulose, pectin, all the other components within wood will be responsive to water. So then, as you can imagine, depending on how those cellulose, which are inert to water, arrange, the transformation of those wood pieces will be different. This is just a little cartoon showing that. And you guys should all know the grains, right? So-called, the fibers within wood have different orientational arrangements. If you just think about this wood like a branch, the top part with normal wood cell, the cellulose are more aligned, oriented along the longitudinal direction of the wood cell, versus the ones at the bottom, the cells at the bottom. So the cellulose are more oriented perpendicular to the longitudinal direction of wood cell. So when water comes, the gray part, you know, not the line, but the gray part will try to expand. Just imagine for a second. So the normal wood cell on the top, the matrix try to expand both ways, actually, vertically and horizontally. However, because the constraints of the wood fiber vertically, it can't expand much. But then there's no constraints laterally speaking. That's why it can see and behave a much larger expansion along the lateral direction. So as a result, the wood cells on the top will more expanding towards the lateral direction, and the wood cell at the bottom will expand more longitudinally. And now if you see this tree trunk has a bilayer, so the top will expand towards the arrow direction, the bottom, again, the arrow direction. So as a result, this whole structure, which is a bilayer, will try to bend up. So again, when we talk about natural morphing matter, there's a very important concept called hierarchical structure. So the macroscopic transformation is highly dictated by the microscopic arrangements of those cellulose and the cellular matrix components. And I think Yasmin also briefly touched upon this. So, and this is heavily studied in her lab, actually, by some pioneers in her lab, even earlier days. If you didn't know, now you know. So basically her advisor, Ahimangas, is a really productive architect who is pushing the limit of computational architecture. So there are a lot of smart material, bio-inspired material experimentations by him in earlier days. He's being invited constantly to give lectures and talks and at Harvard and MIT. That's back then how I got to know him. So earlier days, his lab also directly basically cut veneers out of wood and try to control the morphing behavior. So this diagram basically shows, depends on the orientation and region of the wood, you would also get a different morphing behavior. So for example, if you look at this cross section, it ends up looking a little bit like this. Again, all the lines are cellulose lines. And depending on how the cellulose lines arrange, you will get different morphing behavior. And this is even visible to your eye. So if you hold a piece of veneer, you can see the grain direction. You started to build some intuitions how the wood can morph, and they certainly can be simulated in a computer. So and this was the earlier work Yasmin showed. I'm bringing it up because it's very classic. It was kind of to my knowledge, the earliest application of hydromorphic wood veneer that are being implemented and demonstrated in larger scale in architecture field. And this was even, I want to say, either parallel or earlier than some of the more rigorous analysis and modeling of this phenomenon in more traditional scientific field. And she also showed this. If you guys are curious, you should definitely check the video online. It was a very poetic video, basically showing the holes of each facade panel can open and close depending on the time of the day. And And Yasmin also showed this pine cone. I just want to bring this up to reiterate what I said about cellulose orientation dictates the morphing behavior of natural cellulose organism. So a pine cone is kind of the symbol of morphing matter lab. To me, it is basically a energy efficient morphing system, and that's electricity free. And also, if you look at the scales at the bottom and the top, they all respond differently. So they are kind of sequential motion. The bottom ones open first and the top one open second when the temperature is dry. And again, this can be explained mechanism-wise as a bilayer. So if you look at the top layer of the pine cone scale, the cellulose arranged more laterally, the bottom more vertically. If you remember what I said, for the bottom, then the matrix tends to expand laterally, and the top matrix tends to expand vertically. So that's why, you know, the bottom will try to expand more, so it push the top part to bend upwards. And a lot of the morphing matter design is very heavily to do with the geometrical arrangement. It's, I know we're not talking about software, but you can actually develop softwares to simulate this. But even if you guys can build some intuition out of this class, I think it's also a great success. So if you are more from the physical science field, you might be interested in some of the more kind of fundamental analysis of those bilayer structure. So basically, if you consider, right, it's made of a bilayer, and each layer has a certain thickness, also certain stiffness, terminology-wise, we call it Young's modulus. And then you can actually theoretically calculate the bending curvature you could get out of it. And this is, again, a model. I have the paper cited, feel free to read it. But just high level, if you read this M, N, and K, so M means the ratio of the thickness, N is the ratio of the stiffness of the two layer, and H means the thickness, the total, the absolute thickness of each layer. So basically it's saying the bending curvature eventually is dictated by the thickness of each layer, the ratio of the thickness of the two layers, and also the ratio of the stiffness between the two layers. And this can be used to explain basically a wide spectrum of natural material. And they are not constrained to, indeed, hydromorphic materials. This is a general model for bilayer. So talking about inspirations from nature, one way is you directly cut a piece of wood veneer, you will get this effect. The other is you do biomimetic design. So this was shared in previous work. They were trying to construct a bilayer. Now we know, right? As long as the two layers has different expansion ratio towards a certain direction, you might be able to get some morphing. So what they did is they, if I remember correctly, I think they just glued a piece of 3M tape with a piece of plastic film. Wait, is that true? Glue a paper tape on a piece of plastic film. It's basically plastic paper bilayer. Paper is made of cellulose, eventually derived from wood, right? It will expand, but then the plastic is inert to water. So when you dip it in water, due to capillary, it will drag the water from the reservoir and start to bend. And this was from my work, my collaborative work. So basically, we started to place some of the bacteria on an elastic thin film. This is another way you can make those bilayer structure. So again, it's very, very, very simple, but it's very classic in morphing matter research. To think about bilayer, this is where you start. If you want something more, you are thinking about two layers, one expand more than the other or shrink more than the other. If there is a way you can bond it together or grow it as a whole, right, like nature, you will get some sort of bending. And then from bending, you can do all these complicated geometrical structures like what Yasmin showed earlier. So I think I want to stop here because it's already 11:30. We likely will continue, like I said, there's a lab, we'll continue this conversation, and you will get the chance to experience it firsthand, some of those natural morphing methods as well.